Everyone for joining us. My name is Heidi Dara. I live and work on the unceded territories of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples who are known today as the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations, and I'm so grateful for their stewardship of these lands and the water. I'd like to welcome everyone to this tribute to Pat Lowther's extraordinary poetry, which continues to engage readers and influence contemporary poets. And just to note that this session is being recorded. Lowther's multiple commitments to her children and her community, to politics and poetry, are evident work that spans from the arbutus trees and the rocks of the coast of British Columbia's west coast to the cosmos. Today, we're gathering just a couple of weeks before what should have been, Lowther's 90th birthday. I'm so grateful for the support and the encouragement of Lowther's daughters, Chris and Beth Lowther, in preparing this event to honor their mother's poetic legacy. And I'm delighted that so many of you are joining us from across the country to consider and celebrate Lowther's achievements. We have people joining us today from across Turtle Island on lands that have been the home since time immemorial of our First Peoples. And I'd just like to mention that I've been thinking about the number of poets we have here today. A preponderance of poets has been the phrase that I've been thinking of. And I think that the vast number of you who registered and who are attending today speaks to the fact that Lowther's poetry has been very much a poetic oeuvre that has continued to be significant for contemporary poets. We'll begin this afternoon's presentations with comments from Lowther's biographer, Christine Wiesenthal. Then we'll hear from Molly Pearce, Iain Higgins, and Tanis MacDonald, and I'll introduce each of our speakers in turn. To begin then with Christine Wiesenthal, who is Professor Emeritus of the Department of English and Film Studies at the University of Alberta. She is the author of the critical biography, The Half-Lives of Pat Lowther, as well as the edited volume, The Collected Works of Pat Lowther. She has also published books of poetry and literary criticism and co-edited with Helena Van Pret, Anne Carson and the Unknown, Contemporary Perspectives on Experimental Poetry, which is forthcoming next year from the University of Michigan Press. She's currently working on two other book manuscripts, both of them, these are her own characterization, terrifically unruly messes as yet. Please join me in welcoming Christine.
Thank you, Heidi. I'm very honored to be here today. I'm thrilled to have been asked, and I'm coming to you from Treaty 6 territory in Edmonton, Amiskwiche, Waskagan. So when Heidi first invited me to give a few brief opening remarks about the relationship between biography and the poetry of Pat Lowther, my first response was to be delighted, followed by an immediate sense of, oh no, panic, in that it's a very complicated question to address in a few minutes. The relationship between art and life is a question that, like so many other things in recent decades, has become even more complicated by the changes in our social norms around art and life, publicness and privacy, selfhood in the age of AI, that have really shifted with new media environments and the cultures to which those digital environments give rise. Usually debates about whether we can or should separate the life of an artist from their work get especially pitched in or intensified in cases of tragedy or scandal. And I think any of us could think off the top of our heads about controversies that have lit up the internet recently over artists in that regard, maybe most recently Alice Munro. At one end of the spectrum in such debates, you've got people who insist that art stands on its own and there can be a clean cleavage between an artist's life or biography and their work. And on the other side, you've got the counter belief that the two are so inextricably entangled that they cannot be separated. I think personally, I land somewhere in the middle. I still believe that art is a form of boundary crossing, and that the first boundary that art struggles to cross is that of the self. so that individual experience in art gets transmuted into something other, transmuted, translated, transformed into something other. And as others have pointed out, maybe the question of what is the proper relationship between an artist's life and their work is not the most helpful question to ask. It's impossible to generalize about, for one thing, but maybe the more important question to ask is why we think or feel the way we do about that relationship, which is to ask ourselves, I think, what it is we want or expect from the art that we engage with. What's at stake in our investment? So to turn to the particular case of the poet that we're gathering to celebrate today, Pat Lowther, the question of the uses and the usefulness of biography for engaging with her art is sensitive and complicated in ways that I was trying to figure out and express, to my horror, 20 years ago in the book that Heidi mentioned, The Half-Lives of Pat Lowther. And that was a book that I used the scientific metaphor of the half-life to try to problematize the genre of biography itself as a necessarily partial and artifactual undertaking that is always proceeding from a set of partial, incomplete facts, which always trail off into unknowns, and which is furthermore always distorted by the filtering subjectivity or consciousness of the biographer. So, in other words, a very speculative and precarious undertaking at the best of times. In that book, though, I tried to show how Pat Lowther has been remembered in some ways, but also forgotten or overwritten in the cultural history in others. And I tried to address what I felt then, and I still think is the case now, is her underread poetry and its historical context. So in a nutshell, I would answer Heidi's question, how should we use biography in relation to reading Pat Lowther's poetry, like this? Thoughtfully, with discretion, always asking ourselves how the trace of the author and her lived experience enhances or deepens our appreciation or our comprehension of her art. Scrupulous care in Pat Lowther's case is important precisely because the circumstances of her death have so often threatened to overshadow the achievement of her creative work, with readings that have approached her work as though it is primarily or only autobiographical. Whereas I think if we look at her poetry, we can see that for Pat, poetry was a far-reaching form of imaginal adventure and connection with other places, with other people, with other creatures, including other poet creatures. And so I look at an early poem of hers titled Poetry from 1962, in which she invites us to come walk with me. And I'm quoting a few stanzas from the poem here. I've laid this path with minds set to go off at the first footfall of perception. Firebombs are in the mind, but so is love. Its soft, flowering explosion, scattering violent seed, sweet, sweet. Such violence is my work's intent. Come walk with me, but come. The view is worth the danger. In poetry, Pat Lowther announces the aim of her work, her writing, to unsettle our perception of things, even if that means disturbing us with firebombs in the mind. Readers can choose to walk with her, knowing that art entails taking risks, both for writers and for readers. Ideally, the view is worth the danger. So, biography is only one of many contexts that we might assemble to keep company with Pat's poems. And I'm now looking forward to hearing more about those multiple contexts and seeing how Tanis, Iain, and Molly show us how we can continue to walk with the poetry of Pat Lowther. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Chris. We turn next to Molly Pearce, who is a PhD student in the Department of English at McGill University, which has long served as a meeting place for the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe nations. Molly was born and raised on the unceded traditional territories of the Lekwungen and the Wisanich peoples and completed a master's degree in English at the University of Victoria in 2024. Her research focuses on Canadian and American poetry, the literary small press, and environmental activism in the late 20th century. Welcome, Molly.
Thank you so much, Heidi. I'm so grateful to be here today, and I feel very honored to be invited to share my thoughts on Pat Lowther. Like a good grad student, I do have some slides to share, which will just be serve to have my the poems that I'm looking at today on the screen. So as Heidi said, my name is Molly Pearce, and I'm a PhD student in the English department at McGill. I first encountered Pat Lowther's work during my master's at UVic when I became interested in women's eco-poetics on the West Coast. I crafted a syllabus for an independent reading course with those parameters, and my supervisor at the time suggested that I include Lowther. I was quickly drawn in by the possibilities for critical engagement with the environmental themes in her poetry, and what I read as a form of conservationism in line with nascent environmental feminisms that were present at the time when she was writing. So I hope that in sharing my research on environmental stewardship in Lowther's A Stone Diary, and I'll be looking in particular at inheritance and coast range, I can provide a sense of how, as part of an emerging generation of Canadian literature scholars, I found it personally meaningful and really generative to engage with Pat Lowther's poetics, particularly in the context of my wider research on poetry's role in various strains of environmentalism in the mid and later 20th century. So on a reading list, which led me through a wide range of collections, from P.K. Page's Kaleidoscope, Daphne Marlat's Steveston, Lee Marichel's Bent Box, Jeanette Armstrong's Breath Tracks, among several others, Lowther's A Stone Diary immediately resonated with me for the poignancy with which it evokes a landscape I knew so well, having grown up in coastal BC. Reading A Stone Diary alongside Marichel's Bent Box and Armstrong's Breath Tracks was initially what spurred me to investigate ideas of cultural and environmental stewardship in Lowther's work. I similarly read in Lowther's A Stone Diary an entangled relationship to stewardship, place, and belonging. Each time I return to the collection, I appreciate anew her deft navigation of ideas of environmental stewardship and the difficulties of inciting cultural change. In the identity she crafts for her speaker, I read both a responsibility to conserve and a drive to innovate. So in a paper I wrote on Lowther, Markel, and Armstrong during my master's, I defined this tension as belonging to a creator-conservationist identity. I argued that to trace expressions of women poets as cultural makers and environmental keepers, and these are terms that come from Armstrong's Breath Tracks, across Indigenous and settler communities in British Columbia in the late 20th century, evinces the struggle to reconcile the opposing drives of cultural creation and environmental stewardship. Roughly speaking, these interrelated challenges can be divided into identity, belonging, and expression. It is not possible to attack one issue without invoking another. Place and land form an integral part of identity, and expression is inherently grounded in a strong sense of responsibility to place. The creator-conservationist identity is the poetic persona which occurs in response to these problems, is what I argue. So the anger that these women feel in face of the destruction to their home is necessarily mediated through language, which paradoxically can have the effect of inhibiting precise expression. Each poet feels the contradiction at having to create in order to conserve. So I'll go just to have coast range on the screen there. So in Lowther's Coast Range, the coastal mountains are, quote, so humble they'll let you blast highways through them, end quote. The shapes they've made in the sky cannot be reduced. Lowther's landscape exerts a force back onto humankind, retaliating against its exploitation. Although, quote, the mountains reject nothing, unquote, thrown at them by humans, they, quote, can crack open your mind just by being intractably there. Lowther's mountains are sturdy and resilient in the face of change. In fact, Lowther suggests the only threat that is posed in the end is directed towards us, not the land, and it is a threat to writers. She says, the land is what's left after the failure of every kind of metaphor. To express feelings of stewardship in a medium which requires creation rather than conservation results in poetry which stutters and starts, mimicking Lowther's own mountain landscape with, which, sputters with billy goat bearded creeks. So this paradox is apparent in Coast Range, where Lowther understands land as having integrity and irreducibility. In Inheritance, Lowther comes close to reconciling the opposing drives of creation and conservation. Quote, Annie McCain bequeathed to me her lace, unquote, Lowther writes. Annie McCain, who is Lowther's grandmother, becomes representative of women creators whose work, like the mountains of Coast Range, transcend explanation through language because of its long lifespan. The lace has lived, quote, 25 years in tissue wraps, where it is turning slowly amber like her beautiful hair that never went gray in a long life of making. Annie McCain represents the legacy of women makers who are able to simultaneously create and conserve. The result of Annie's skills, presumably taught to her by her own mother or grandmother in a generational cycle, is an object which is strong enough to last through time to be passed down. In Inheritance, Lowther is able to momentarily resolve the contradiction of her creator and conservationist drives through a matrilineal tradition. She concludes, Annie McCain's lace runs through all my thumbs like something I can't even regret. So whether home for us is North Vancouver, coastal BC, or other places in Canada or further afield, we turn to eco-poetry to refine our relationship with the environment, to deepen our respect for it, and to nuance our understanding of the integrity of its features. Being one of the first poets whose work I engaged with in earnest in my academic training, my own inheritance from Lowther feels all the more significant. I feel that my journey with her work, both personally and academically, will extend far into my career as a scholar and will continue to influence my relationship with the land I care so deeply for, even when my career takes me far away from it. So I'd just like to thank everybody so much again for allowing me to share these thoughts on Lowther. And I hope that it gives a bit of a sense perhaps about where her scholarship is going with people in my generation who become interested. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Molly. And I'm reminded of a passage in Chris Lowther's new book, Blockade, in which she talks about her mother and a story about a tree protest. So you might want to have a look at that. I can pass that along to you. Thank you. And we will move now to Iain Higgins. Iain teaches in the English Department and Medieval Studies program at UVic. He's currently editor of the Malahat Review. He's a writer, translator, and critic whose books include Then Again, a book of poems, and Writing East, the travels of Sir John Mandeville. He lives on the traditional lands of the Lekwungen peoples, the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasinich peoples, whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. Welcome, Iain.
Thank you, Heidi. Can you all hear me? Good. Excellent. Thank you for organizing this. Thank you for inviting me. Thanks to anyone behind the scenes who's helping you out with this. It's really a pleasure and a privilege for me to be here with Chris and Molly and Tanis celebrating Pat Lowther's work. I never met Pat Lowther. I was just finishing high school in 1977 when A Stone Diary was published posthumously, and I was not yet a reader of poetry, to which I came late, and I came even later to Canadian poetry. I think I first read Lowther's poems with serious attention in 1997 when Time Capsule was published, a book which sent me then to her other books, and to which I've recently returned in advance of our gathering today. I can say that I found the contents of the Time Capsule even richer this time. They remain compelling, not only as documents of a life and a time gathered for later eyes, but also many of them as achieved poems with a continuing claim on anyone who loves poetry. Returning to the book, I can see more clearly this time how Time Capsule charts Lowther's poetic growth. But this is not a growth from youthful gawkiness to increasing maturity, from flashes of brilliance to proper fires. It's rather a continual and generally successful coming into her own engaged and engaging poetics, a kind of prismatic poetics, bending and sometimes even breaking and scattering the light to bring her readers into a complex seeing. In today's context, where each of us on this warm July afternoon will be mercifully brief, I want to celebrate Lowther's available work by offering a brief ABC. In Brot and Wine, Bread and Wine, a long elegy written around 1800, Friedrich Hölderlin asks, Wozu Dichter in dürftige Zeit? What use poets in hard times? For poets and poetry, always and everywhere, the times are rarely propitious, more often unpropitious, though how hard or wretched they are for any given poet depends a great deal on accidents of birth, as well as on the circumstances of time and place. About 150 years after Hölderlin's elegy, A.M. Klein was worrying the question of neglecting portrait of the poet as landscape. It's a perennial theme. For Lowther, as for many poets through the ages, the times were mixed. In her time, she experienced both personal hardship, Christine Wiesenthal has demonstrated in her biography, and increasing literary participation and recognition at a moment of opening for English language literature in Canada. Tragically, she was not able to enter fully into that opening space and make her dwelling there. For us here today, the institutions and networks of poetry that were being created or expanded in Lowther's time look increasingly fragile, like coral reefs on the verge of being bleached of life, both their own and those of the beings in their ecosystems. Still, even in hard times, poetry can survive, since good poems are concentrated packets of vital energy that at least some of us human beings want to share amongst ourselves for sustenance. And these packets ask us to unwrap and ingest them in quite different ways from the ways in which we consume the energy-sapping commodities now almost instantly available, no matter what time it is or what the times are. Good poems take us back to basics, in other words. And so to my ABC. I'll sketch the ABC very briefly first, and then turn to a single, compact, elliptical poem to illustrate those claims, thereby finishing with Pat Lowther's words. So A, alertness and attentiveness. Lowther's most achieved work strikes me as equally alert and attentive, both to what's going on in the poem and what's going on outside it, so that the relation between the two, between the poem as a made thing standing on its own, and the poem as an unfolding speech act responding to and engaging with the world beyond it, keeps a reader aware of both. B, body, belly, bone, and stone. Stone isn't really a B word, but you'll see why it's here. The body, including the non-human body, is everywhere in Lowther's poetry, often with direct or indirect reference to the belly, to which she draws attention as both gendered and engendering. The word womb, like belly, goes back to Old English, in which the two words are roughly synonymous. Besides flesh with its tenderness and vulnerability, and sometimes its fierceness, Lowther turns her poetic attention also to bone and its extracorporeal analog, stone, meditating variously on the complex relations between the organic and the inorganic. C, clasping and clashing and caressing. At its most ambitious and compelling, Lowther's poetry seems to me committed to comprehending contradiction, taking comprehension in its multiple senses, which range from grasping physically or intellectually to including or embracing. Hers are conscious poems rather than self-conscious, and they are conscious of a very wide range of experience and all sorts of phenomena. A concern with class and gender, for example, doesn't exclude a concern with other creatures like octopi, slugs, moon jellies, or even the cosmos in which we all find ourselves. Now to my example. First, in its entirety, a very short poem published in 1997, Cada cabeza es un mundo. It has a Spanish title, which it means every head is a world, and it's only 5 lines long. This alone protected as jewels or ova, a chalice of smooth bone, a cradle of water inside the strange gray planet. This compact elliptical poem illustrates in miniature, I think, most, if not quite all, of the ABCs I've just laid out. And like the head it celebrates, it contains more than it explicitly says, a saying that is both explicable and yet mysterious. Who can think of their head in the same way after hearing or reading this poem? The poem also shows us a poet confident in her gift, trusting her readers by opening with a line, this alone protected, that cannot quite be grasped grammatically. How do we understand protected here? Until a second line, which itself uses the slightly more marked and awkward as rather than the expected like, as jewels or ova. We are thereby lightly unsettled into this poem's world. Jewels or ova is also an unexpected yet entirely characteristic collocation, hard and soft, inorganic and organic, protected and yet subject to violence. And it's also the start of a list, which is what the poem formally is. Lists are superficially easy, but therefore also risky because potentially arbitrary, though this one is clearly not. Its elements resonate in complex and thought-provoking ways with one another, and even though it is a short and simple list, it is as evocative sonically, syntactically, and semantically as any subtle pencil sketch of just a few strokes in which the blank space is not merely empty. No one thing here is fully itself without also being something else, the list itself thereby becoming a multiple metaphor. The opening three lines of this list are bound together by the triple echo of alone, ova, bone, a sonic play that is subtly transposed into the binding work of another long vowel, cradle, strange, gray. By virtue of this play of sound sense, even the weakest word in the poem, strange, is strengthened and renewed, taking us into cosmic mystery whereby the gray matter contained in a chalice, in a cradle, is refigured as a planet. Our head is a chalice, it's a cradle, it's a planet, it's our head. It's there in English and in Spanish, right? This just keeps getting more and more interesting. One of Wallace Stevens's last poems is called The Planet on the Table, a title meant to refer to his collected poems. Lowther's Cada cabeza es un mundo, brief though it is, suggests that, pages are set together here, that the planet in the head, like the planet on the table, can itself contain other planets, both nested inwards and expanding outwards, like Russian dolls or a Ptolemaic cosmos of concentric spheres. This poem is a time capsule of the book Time Capsule, which is itself a time capsule of all of Lowther's books. And to continue the cosmic analogy for anyone here who's a Doctor Who fans, like the Time Lord's TARDIS, it is far bigger on the inside than its outside suggests. So what I'd like to do to honor and celebrate Pat Lowther then is finish by reading one poem from her last writings. It's called Choice. I'm not going to put it on the screen because I just want you to hear the poem. Choice. I have not watched the seasons by this year, not marked the months, only I know it is late this morning, late for the first injection of light to be spreading under the sky's skin. And I am old, stone old, to hear this mounded earth muttering unwelcome waking, and the thick spider speech of fruit trees clotting the close horizon. And I wait for a hand to stifle, as one would stifle a yawn, the faint exhalation of the city's nighttime neon. Then to turn away, not to send out breath, stretched eyes and all senses, nor wait for the first bird to tongue the air, not to be the clear scream and wingbeat of the sun over everything piled and particularized with frost, nor bear this chill integrity into the day, but to turn fleshly and small, exact, to the full moon's spectrum and thousand alternatives demanding choice, demanding cultivation, and the stone years set behind like winter before the miracle of owning hands and a mouth shaped for the colloquial, and now take on these vivid, numbered years and build a world within a world human. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Iain. It's hard to not want to just sit with that poem and those gorgeous images and sounds. We'll turn to our final speaker, Tanis MacDonald. Tanis is the author of Straggle, Adventures in Walking While Female, highly recommended, as well as 6 other books of poetry and nonfiction. She has twice been the winner of the Open Seasons Award, once in 2021 for her essay of female friendship and music fandom, and then again in 2025 for her essay on adoption and ancestry. She has been longlisted for the CBC Poetry Prize. Tanis was raised in Treaty 1 territory and now lives as a grateful guest on traditional Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe land near the Grand River in southwestern Ontario, where she teaches in the Department of English and Film Studies at Wilfrid Laurier University. Her next book, Tall Grass Girl, is forthcoming with Book Hug Press. Welcome, Tanis.
Thanks very much, Heidi. And again, thank you for inviting me to speak at this wonderful celebration of Pat Lowther's work. Iain, I'm really glad you did some ABCs because my short paper is called Cosmological Creatures. I'm going to pick up on that C, so reading Pat Lowther. And it starts with something that Chris Wiesenthal began with. How do we remember poets? So got some ways we can do that. With love, with humor, by paying attention to the poetry itself, with a close reading, with our voices of the present still thinking of the future and the importance of keeping memory alive. With events like this one, and like the Whole Cloth reading series in Vancouver, the organizers of which stayed a communal reading of a stone diary at UBC's Green College just this past April. Thanks to LA Carl G. Gardner and Bronwyn Tate for their work there. We can also remember poets by asking people how they remember, by reading, by talking, and by getting younger generations to read their poems. Thank you, Molly, for stepping in for that piece. To study what they wrote and to take seriously the task of thinking about those poems. We remember by memorial awards, biographies, critical discussions, conference papers, journal articles, and oral stories. And we also remember by opening up our libraries and passing on to other people out of print books, those rarities, those scribbled in volumes to other poetry lovers. And if those younger or other poetry lovers say, I don't know this poet, we say, you should read this. You'll really like it. Curate like you mean it and spread those books around. I say this as someone who just released many books back into the wild because you can't own them forever. I gave them to my favorite secondhand bookseller that a former student co-owns for the enjoyment of others after I pressed several books into the hands of students and colleagues. And I come by this knowledge honestly because I have Perry Nodelman's former copy of a stone diary. And I either inherited this in the months when I occupied Perry's former office at the University of Winnipeg, or I bought it at Heaven Art and Book Cafe, which was a poetry bookstore like no other in Winnipeg. I got my copy of Final Instructions. It's numbered 82 out of 200, a print run of 200. And I don't remember where I bought it, but I'm pretty sure it was somewhere in Victoria between 2000 and 2005. So those are my gems that I haven't let go of yet. Perry Nodelman's here in spirit because he made handwritten notes on the flyleaf of the stone diary that of course I read, and of course I'm going to tell you about them now. They're a little cryptic, and I'm not certain I'm reading his writing correctly, but by squinting a little, look at that. It's tiny print. By squinting a little, I think Perry wrote this: a sense of something unknown moving below the surface and in between, the fragility of the moment. This is why you should always buy used books, so you can think not only with the writer, but with the reader who read them before. So with Perry's comment, I want to pay special attention to 2 poems in a stone diary on the basis that poetic attention is the best tribute. And I thought I would look at 2 very creaturely poems, Anemone and Octopus. One of the challenges, as many of you who write will know, is to write our fellow creatures with respect and with language that meets them where they live, considers their lives beyond human contact. And of course, the irony is that to do that, we have to observe them and have at least a little bit of human contact. I think about Robin Wall Kimmerer writing to address what she calls our species loneliness. When you want to write about something you love and read other people who love it. So my central mission will be to learn from these poems how to write creatures and I'll ask everyone to consider the writing of creatures, either for your own writing practice or as readers. This is going to be a little pedagogical, a bit exploratory, and a lot appreciative. So I'm going to read Octopus first, and I do have a copy that I'm going to share. Octopus. The octopus is beautifully functional as an umbrella. At rest, a bag of rucked skin sags like an empty scrotum, his gelled eyes sad and bored, but taking flight. Look how purposeful, how lovely, purposeful in every part. The jet vent smooth as modern plumbing, the webbed pinwheel of tentacles moving in perfect accord like a machine dreamed by Leonardo. So think about that cascade of metaphor. First the umbrella, then a scrotum, and then by implication, a bird taking flight, then plumbing, then a pinwheel, and then a machine dreamed by Leonardo da Vinci. So that movement between spikiness and softness, between human and avian bodies, and at last turning to the irony that our language arrives at the past plans for the future, when the octopus is so vitally present in this poem. And of course, it's also a creature whose evolution from shelled creature to current form is still flabbergasting marine biologists because of their newly discovered ability to edit their RNA. Yes, it's true. You can read it in Scientific American. And this, when I read it in Scientific American, the article quoted the claim from Nobel Prize winning biologist Sidney Bremer that octopi were the first intelligent beings on Earth. If you've seen the film My Octopus Teacher, you will know what I mean. While the octopus in the poem is suggested to be designed by Leonardo, we should also consider that of course it hasn't, and that the octopus is to an extent her own Leonardo, that great leap forward into her form. So for me, it's the smoothness of that complex slide of metaphors. How Lowther notes that the creature seems to shapeshift by being both a creature of ancient lineage and future invention, but also remains strangely and beautifully itself. And the language, the words repeat a plosive of the P and the lolling of the L sound. So the sonic effect is a repeated plop, 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 watery and propulsive, that jet vent in action. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing this and read anemones to you. I want you to think about mirroring as you listen. Anemones. Under the wharf at Saturna, the sea anemones open their velvet bodies, chalk black and apricot and lemon white. They grow as huge and glimmering as flesh chandeliers. Under the warped and salt-stained wharf, letting down their translucent mouths of arms. Even the black ones have an aura like an after image of light. Under our feet, the gorgeous animals are feeding in the sky. So my research into anemone anatomy, that's very hard to say, anemone anatomy, was a bit dizzying, as these creatures are even less like humans than octopi are, but that phrase, mouths of arms, is key. We can see the poet reaching for the banal and the bizarre in a single phrase, that tipped up perspective of someone gazing below the wharf at a life form that seems alien and yet not. That upended sea and sky of the last stanza, when the reflected sky gives us a taste of vertigo, literally not knowing which way is up, and the anemones themselves as flesh chandeliers, an audacious metaphor, if there was one. In A Stone Diary, and as Molly quoted earlier, Pat writes, "The land is what's left after the failure of every kind of metaphor." And it's certainly true that metaphors can get us into trouble if we choose to mask or obscure or deny reality. But in the two poems we've just looked at, metaphor is movement, a perspective shift so marked that I can feel the ground swing beneath my feet in anemones. These are sharp poems with an astronomical reach, exploring the order in disorder and vice versa. And considering the everyday with the cosmological was something that Pat did with Elan and with Joy, I'm going to read one last poem. And I'm not going to comment on it, but just end with it. This is Riding Past from Time Capsule. Long streets of houses with lighted roofs, black against winter sky, blue as Venetian glass, with Venus hanging like a small yellow moon. In the houses, people are cooking food and scolding children. The ones home from work are hanging their coats up. Telephones are ringing behind the yellow windows. Come, open the doors. Yellow triangles and steam of meat and potatoes. Stand on the front steps, stare at the sky and wave. Look, we're riding past Venus. I want to thank Heidi again for asking me to speak today, and to Beth and Christine for their generosity in sharing their mother with us.
Thank you so much, Tanis. And that is one of my favorite poems. So it was lovely to hear that read out loud. I have so appreciated the work that all of our presenters have done to approach Pat Lowther's poetry with a spirit of attentiveness today. We've left some time for questions. And to post a question, please write it into the Q&A. It won't be visible to everyone. It will be visible to all of the panelists, however. And as time permits, we will take as many of them as possible. We may combine some of them if there is some overlap. As you contemplate your questions and type those into the Q&A, I'd like to turn first to the panel members and ask them if anyone has a comment that they would like to make in response to another presentation. There was a really nice interweaving of themes there, I thought, today. And I thought I'd leave panelists a moment to comment on it if they would care to.
I'm always fascinated when a panel is put together and people don't consult, and then we end up having all kinds of links, right? And I had a moment where earlier this week where I was going to consult with people about what they were writing, so we didn't, all concentrate on the same poems. But then I thought, no, there's something about leaving that up to synchronicity and the cosmological workings of a panel. So I was very glad to see us all sort of coming together on a number of things to talk about.
Yeah, I would agree with that. What struck me about listening to the other presentations, apart from the way that it illuminated Pat Lowther's work for me and celebrated it, was each time one of you quoted a poem, I thought, I'm glad I didn't quote that one, because I had them all lined up on my desk when I was trying to think of the one poem that I could use for the ABCs. And it was just actually uncanny how every single quotation was one that I was struggling to decide, include or exclude. So that says something too about the coherence of Lowther's work across the years, because there are these things that come in and out, and all of us are responding to them from different angles today, but all responding to the same kinds of call that she's sending out to us as readers and listeners.
Molly, please. And then we have a question from Catherine.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to thank Tanis for bringing up the octopus and anemone poems, because those are two of my favorite Lowther poems, and I find that I often can't engage critically in the same way when they're kind of ones that I know that I'm so personally drawn to. I feel like the distance isn't there, but I'm so grateful for your perspective on those, and I think that the idea of the cascading metaphors is such a beautiful one and so poignant for those. So I just wanted to say thank you for bringing those ones up.
Oh, you're more than welcome.
And Chris, sorry, I'd missed your hand there.
I just wanted to add that one thing I really enjoyed about all three presentations on the poetry was this sense of return. Molly suggested that going back every time she sees something new in the poems that she's working on. Iain talked about Lowther's prismatic poetics. And Tanis, your wonderful return to those treasures that you haven't let go yet and reading the marginalia. That was really wonderful for me for various reasons. But so because I also went back as I was preparing for today, not knowing what anybody else was going to exactly speak about. And I remembered, oh my goodness, the intensity of working with Lowther's papers, and how often I was bothering Christine and Beth over things. And yet the concurrent theme, I think, aside from the return and the joy of returning to find new things in Lowther's poetry, was this sense of an ongoing journey and a futurity. And that's embodied by someone of Molly's generation who is now working on Lowther in an eco-poetic context. But that's just one observation that I would add. Yeah.
Thank you. And we have several questions now. So what I'll do is I'll just read them in sequence. Some of them are addressed to particular panelists, and others are open for anyone to respond to who has thoughts. And we'll start with you, Iain. Could you please speak more about the stone part of your ABCs?
Well, I could keep us here all day, but I won't do that. I deliberately put it with bone because, in a way, going back to what we saw in each of the presentations today, that kind of multifacetedness and interconnectedness that we see in Pat Lowther's poetry is there in that connection between stone and bone. And it's I think there are a number of ways to read it, because like everything in her poetry, it is contradictory. So bodies are beautiful, wonderful things. They're also, capable of violence and so on, right? They're capable of engendering, etc., absorbing. And stone in her work includes a stone that's used to smash a monument, for example. It's the stone oldness of coming to consciousness of the world. It's the stones on the path. And so it's part of this sense that we see in a different way in A Stone Diary, which was talked about before, and also the Anemone and the Octopus poems, where human beings are not separate from the world around them. They're embedded in it. They're part of it. And there's a kind of multiplicity there. So I could have spent stone, bone, belly, etc. I could have spent the whole time talking about just one of those words, because they run through the poems. But I think the stoniness there is that it's that connection between the human and the chthonic, the earth that we belong to, which is also figured in the poem that I read as water, a cradle of water, right? So even stone and water are, in a sense, continuous with each other. I don't know if that answers the question, but I think, it's something that if you read through the poems in any order, dip into them, Stone is there all the time, and it's there in these multiple, multifaceted, connective ways.
Thank you, Iain. A biographical question next. For Chris, can you envision a revised edition of your book with a new chapter or two? And if so, what new information would you want to include in your biography?
Oh my goodness, what a terrific question. I would have never anticipated that. If I were to go back to it, I'd probably chop. I think I was too verbose. So maybe a slimmer edition. There was, when I was writing that book, I didn't realize how much I guess I had to say. And could I envision? So I couldn't envision adding to it. It would have to be rewritten in a way that I think would be more succinct. But, I think it's also wonderful to hear newer voices speaking about like a poetics of the Anthropocene and how someone like Lowther anticipates that from younger scholars who are now working on her. So I'd say no, I'm not making any imminent plans to go back to it. But thank you for the question, because that's food for thought, definitely.
Thank you, Chris. Pen Kemp notes, and I'm just going to read this verbatim. When I hosted Pat at Ace Base in Toronto at one of her very last readings, she passed a stone around a small circle. We were to hold it in our hand until we could feel its energy. I think it was a fossilized dinosaur bone. Does anyone know? Chris, maybe? With thanks. Anyone have any thoughts about that?
Beth or Christine, have you ever heard anything? That sounds like a anecdote that maybe family members might have heard of. I did not hear anything about that. I do know that Pat was extremely attentive, as Iain has already suggested, to stones as characters, as animate beings that do encapsulate a kind of energy. And that's one of the reasons she loved Main Island so much, was just walking the shores and looking at the rock formations. But I did not hear that particular story. So sorry, I can't help, but maybe Chris or Beth.
Chris is typing no idea. But this prompts me to note that several of you, when you wrote to me to register for this event, had some really interesting stories and anecdotes to share. And I'm so hoping that it will be okay to convey those to Chris and Beth Lowther. And I would encourage anyone who's listening today who has some memory of being a reader, of encountering Pat Lowther, to please share those, because it is in many ways, as Chris Wiesenthal has described so clearly, a fragmented and complicated archive and legacy. And can we turn to another biographical question here? Can anyone comment briefly about how Lowther's life experiences as a young girl and teen influenced her evolution as a poet, her style, her subjects? I think the obvious person to turn to here is her biographer, and I was just rereading this section, and your discussion of the very unlikeliness of how she moved from being a high school dropout who was doing secretarial work that was boring her to tears to taking some adult ed courses in creative writing, and this 7-year extraordinary span of activity.
Yeah, it is remarkable, isn't it? I mean, in so many ways, it's not that long historically that Pat was a child, right, or a teenager, and yet in some ways we like the solitude that she would have experienced in North Vancouver growing up, like Lynn Creek, that area. It just so remote, even as a young bride, the first-time wife, living with her first husband out in Deep Cove. Things were not as connected as they are today. Never mind, just highways, infrastructure was so rudimentary. And so books, one of the things that I thought about when I was researching the book was, what would Pat have had access to as she was growing up to read, and the skid libraries that they had out in BC at the time were very, very, very rudimentary. So, she, I think, was inwardly resourceful in the sense that, as Iain, I think, said, she was alert and attentive, right, to her world, and that sensory engagement with the world just fired her imagination until she got some, touch hold of connection to a creative writing course that she could take, and then some access to books. But it is very sobering to me to think, even back in the 70s, how tenuous the distribution across Canada was for small presses. All those things that those literary infrastructures that today, are again in a precarious way. But it was a very remarkable largely autodidactic development. Stunning.
And sorry to keep you on the spot, Chris, but our last question also touches on this. And other panelists, please jump in as well. Lowther was also, the question asked, an urban single mom on social assistance and a political activist. And this was also present in her work. Any comments from anyone on the panel on favorites from these politically influenced and engaged poems?
Does anybody else want to jump in?
I'll just briefly comment that a poem like Chachabuco the Pit, about political prisoners in Chile, is an amazing poem, and too long for me to gloss here. But I think she was really dedicated, and I think she really had the fire in the belly when it came to being interested in political action in Chile. In particular, because of her interest in Pablo Neruda, and of course some of the things that were going on with the Chilean coup. But no, she's a very strong political writer as well.
I think even of the poems that were read today, for instance, the ones that you chose, Molly, speak very much to a social context. The activism comes out more in a stone diary, of course, but they're about that experience of living in an extractive colonial environment in one case, another case living in a gendered history. There's a lot of political poems, social poems. Most of them require more sort of contextualization than we would have time for today. But poems like Readings from the Incredible Shrinking Woman or Intersection, for example, are poems that very subtly move into her own positionality. These are longer poems. They're like the Chilean poem that Tanis mentioned and so on, that really would require a lot more unpacking, and that would, we could do a whole session probably just devoted to one of these poems and talking about the way it sort of exfoliates from her own commitments. But yeah, again, like the other things, these run through every book.
Yeah, Iain, I was also thinking of the poem Intersection with regard to the city. And it's one of my favorites because she was an inveterate bus rider, right? So she got to know her city well through public transit. And even shorter poems like the City Slide series, City Slide 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. She's very intimate with moving around the city. And being alert to advertisements, being alert to how we are in the messaging that we absorb on a day-to-day basis, and being circumscribed by as a woman who did not have a lot of disposable cash to purchase luxuries, right? Her attentiveness to renting, to being a tenant, as opposed to owning property, and her sense of tenancy. That is to say that we don't, her whole concept of owning property. I think there's a poem where she talks about, I will hold you, never to possess you, but to let you go. Or there's always that sense of tentativeness that I think was conditioned by, as the questioner points out, her subjectivity as a single mother with significant financial challenges. Yeah.
Yeah. Even bus riding, for example, requires contextualization, especially out here on the West Coast, where cities don't have public transit in the form of subways and so on. And I grew up, and one of the things you'd hear people saying is, "Oh, who rides buses? Buses are for poor people," right? And it was very much a class sense of that. And so writing poems like that about standing at an intersection waiting for a bus is very much an address to that kind of awareness.
So many thanks. And I'm so sorry to call a halt and to not get to quite all of our questions, because we have some additional really interesting and provocative questions. But given time constraints and that we will be artificially cut off in just a few minutes, I will take this opportunity to thank our panelists again for bringing us these very provocative engagements with Pat Lowther's work and legacy. I wanted to mention to you as well, in closing, that Sean Cranberry has been working on the development of a wonderful Pat Lowther website that includes some fascinating materials from her career, including an audio recording of an early reading that Lowther gave at the University of Regina. More recently, I was reading a very important review essay that is also posted on the Lowther website of Time Capsule. And so I'd like to end our session today with just a very brief quotation from the end of Barton's essay. Like Neruda's poetry, which Lowther equates with a bloodstone, the dark jewel of history, hers is a seed patient as time that Canadian literature is entrusted to carry into the future. Many thanks to all of you for joining us today and for helping to carry Lowther's poetry into the future. Your presence has been appreciated. Thank you so much, and goodbye.